Princess Diana's story remains one of the most emotional, complicated, and unforgettable stories connected with the modern British royal family. Decades after her death, people around the world still remember her smile, her elegance, her vulnerability, her compassion, and the extraordinary way she connected with ordinary people. She lived in palaces, attended royal ceremonies, wore some of the most beautiful dresses in the world, met presidents and world leaders, and became one of the most photographed women of her generation. Yet behind the glamour was a woman who experienced loneliness, emotional pressure, public criticism, a troubled marriage, intense media attention, and a constant struggle to find a life that truly belonged to her. Her story was never simply the story of a young woman who married a prince. It became the story of a woman who entered one of the most powerful institutions in the world, struggled inside it, slowly discovered her own identity, and eventually used her fame to draw attention to people who were often ignored by society. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, in Norfolk, England. She was born into the Spencer family, an aristocratic British family that had long-standing connections with the royal household. From the outside, her childhood might have appeared privileged. She grew up surrounded by large houses, beautiful countryside, traditions, and the social world of the British upper class. However, privilege could not protect her from emotional pain. When Diana was still young, the relationship between her parents broke down. Their separation and divorce deeply affected her. For a sensitive child who wanted stability, love, and reassurance, watching her family divide was extremely painful. Those early experiences helped shape the woman Diana would later become. She understood what it meant to feel insecure. She knew what loneliness felt like. She understood that a beautiful house did not automatically create a happy home. These lessons stayed with her and may help explain why, later in life, she was unusually sensitive to the suffering of children, patients, homeless people, and others who felt abandoned or forgotten. Diana was not particularly famous for academic achievement during her school years. Her strengths were different. She enjoyed music, dancing, swimming, and working with children. She had a natural warmth that made people feel comfortable around her. She reportedly dreamed of becoming a dancer, particularly a ballet dancer, although that path did not become her future. What remained constant was her affection for children and her desire to care for others. As a young woman, Diana moved to London. Her life at that time was remarkably ordinary compared with what would soon follow. She shared accommodation with friends, spent time with other young women, and worked with children, including as an assistant at a nursery school. Photographs of Diana during this period show a shy young woman who could hardly have imagined the scale of the attention that would soon surround her. Her life changed dramatically when her relationship with Prince Charles began attracting serious attention. Charles, the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II and the heir to the British throne, was one of the most eligible men in the world. Diana already had connections to the social world around the royal family, and Charles had previously known Diana's older sister. Over time, however, his attention turned toward Diana. Their relationship quickly became a national fascination. Journalists followed Diana. Photographers waited outside places where they thought she might appear. Newspapers wanted to know everything about the young woman who might become the future queen. Diana was young, shy, attractive, aristocratic, and apparently innocent of the complicated world of royal politics. To the public, she appeared to be the perfect fairy tale princess. In February 1981, the engagement of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer was officially announced. Diana was only 19 when the engagement became public. Suddenly, she was no longer simply a young nursery assistant trying to build an ordinary life. She was preparing to marry the future king of the United Kingdom. The public reaction was enormous. People celebrated the engagement as though a fairy tale had come to life. Newspapers printed endless photographs of Diana. Every detail of her clothing, expressions, hairstyle, and behavior was analyzed. She became famous before she had even married. Yet one moment from the engagement period would later seem painfully symbolic. When Charles and Diana were asked whether they were in love, Diana answered confidently, while Charles gave the now famous response, "Whatever in love means." At the time, many people treated it lightly. Years later, after the difficulties of their marriage became known, the comment seemed far more significant. On July 29, 1981, Charles and Diana married at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Hundreds of millions of people across the world watched the ceremony. Streets were filled with cheering crowds. Diana arrived wearing an enormous ivory wedding gown with a famously long train. To viewers watching on television, she seemed to have stepped directly from the pages of a storybook. She became Diana, Princess of Wales. For millions of people, it was the wedding of the century. A beautiful young woman had married a prince. She would live in royal residences, attend glittering events, travel the world, and perhaps one day become queen beside her husband. But real life was far more complicated than the fairy tale presented to the public. Diana entered royal life when she was still extremely young. The monarchy operated according to traditions, expectations, rules, schedules, formalities, and pressures that were very different from ordinary life. Every movement attracted attention. Every outfit could become a headline. Every facial expression could be photographed and interpreted. Diana was expected to remain composed, elegant, polite, and publicly supportive regardless of what she might be feeling privately. The pressure was enormous. She also became aware that the emotional relationship between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles had not simply disappeared from his life. Diana's suspicions about Charles and Camilla caused tremendous pain and insecurity within the marriage. What the public believed to be a perfect romantic union was, privately, becoming deeply troubled. Still, Diana threw herself into her public responsibilities. When she accompanied Charles on royal tours, something unexpected began to happen. Crowds were often more excited to see Diana than the future king. People loved her appearance, but their fascination went much deeper than beauty. Diana possessed an unusual ability to communicate emotionally through small gestures. She bent down to speak with children instead of towering over them. She listened attentively to people describing painful experiences. She touched people. She hugged them. She made eye contact. She often appeared less like a distant royal figure and more like a compassionate young woman who happened to be wearing royal clothes. During international visits, crowds waited for hours simply to see her. Photographers discovered that pictures of Diana sold newspapers. Fashion magazines wanted her photographs. Television networks followed her movements. Designers wanted to dress her. Eventually, she became one of the most recognizable women on the planet. Such popularity brought admiration, but it also created tension. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for royal responsibility. Yet when the couple arrived somewhere together, crowds could chant Diana's name. Cameras could turn toward Diana. Newspaper headlines could focus almost entirely on her. The extraordinary imbalance of attention placed further strain on an already difficult marriage. Meanwhile, Diana was fighting private emotional battles. She later spoke publicly about bulimia, depression, feelings of isolation, and periods of profound emotional distress. Her openness was extraordinary because discussions of mental health were far less common in public life at the time, particularly among members of the royal family. The institution around her was built upon dignity, restraint, tradition, and emotional control. Diana, however, was experiencing emotions that could not simply be hidden behind palace walls forever. She desperately wanted affection, reassurance, and understanding. Becoming a mother transformed her life. Prince William was born in June 1982. Prince Harry followed in September 1984. Diana adored her sons and approached motherhood in ways that sometimes differed from traditional royal expectations. She was physically affectionate with them. She hugged them openly. She wanted to participate in their everyday lives. She helped choose aspects of their schooling, took them on ordinary outings, and tried to introduce them to experiences beyond palace life. She understood that William and Harry were princes, but she did not want them to believe that royal status separated them from the struggles of ordinary people. Diana took her sons to places where they could see different realities of life. She wanted them to understand homelessness, illness, poverty, and suffering. She also gave them experiences familiar to many ordinary children, including amusement parks and casual restaurants. Her approach reflected one of her strongest beliefs: titles did not remove a person's responsibility to understand other human beings. While her love for her sons gave Diana enormous strength, her marriage continued deteriorating. Public appearances could still create photographs of a glamorous royal couple, but behind those photographs were years of disappointment, resentment, misunderstanding, and emotional separation. Diana increasingly felt isolated within the royal system. Charles also had his own frustrations and unhappiness. Their personalities, interests, emotional needs, and expectations were significantly different. Eventually, the problems could no longer remain completely hidden. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, reports about the marriage became increasingly common. Newspapers speculated about arguments and affairs. Books began examining Diana's experiences inside the royal family. One of the most important was Andrew Morton's 1992 book about Diana, which presented an extraordinary account of her unhappiness, bulimia, emotional distress, and marital problems. The revelation shocked the world. For years, Diana had represented a modern royal fairy tale. Suddenly, the public was learning that the fairy tale had contained enormous suffering. Yet something important was happening at the same time. Diana was changing. The shy 19-year-old who had once looked nervously at cameras was becoming a confident public figure. Pain had wounded her, but it had also forced her to understand herself. She started realizing that her enormous fame could be used for something far greater than fashion photographs or royal ceremonies. She began using attention as a weapon for compassion. Whenever Diana visited a hospital, journalists followed. Whenever she traveled to a charity, photographers followed. Whenever she touched someone, cameras captured the moment. Diana understood that the media attention that made her personal life unbearable could also draw worldwide attention toward causes that desperately needed recognition. One of the most famous examples involved HIV and AIDS. During the 1980s, misinformation about HIV created widespread fear. Some people incorrectly believed they could become infected simply by touching someone who had the virus. Individuals living with HIV or AIDS frequently faced terrible discrimination and isolation. Diana challenged that fear in an extraordinarily simple way. She shook hands with HIV-positive patients without wearing gloves. Today, such an action might seem ordinary, but in the climate of fear surrounding AIDS at the time, the image was powerful. A globally famous princess was publicly touching someone whom society had often treated as untouchable. One photograph could challenge millions of misconceptions. Diana visited hospitals, sat beside patients, listened to their stories, and treated them with dignity. She understood that illness did not erase humanity. Her message was not complicated. People suffering from disease needed compassion, not rejection. Her work extended far beyond HIV and AIDS. She supported causes involving children, cancer patients, homelessness, leprosy, mental health, and other humanitarian issues. Her emotional style was different from the formal charity work traditionally associated with royalty. Diana did not simply arrive, shake hands with administrators, pose for a photograph, and leave. She often wanted personal contact with the people affected. She sat beside hospital beds. She hugged children. She held hands. She listened. That willingness to physically and emotionally connect with vulnerable people transformed her public identity. She was still glamorous, but glamour was no longer the most important part of her image. She was becoming a humanitarian. In December 1992, Prime Minister John Major announced that Charles and Diana had separated. The announcement confirmed what the public had suspected for years. Their marriage had effectively collapsed. For Diana, separation brought uncertainty, but it also brought a new kind of independence. She was still connected to the royal family and remained the mother of the future king. Her every action continued to attract intense public attention. But gradually she began shaping a life with more independence. The conflict surrounding the marriage became even more public during the following years. Charles publicly acknowledged his adultery in a televised interview. Diana later participated in her own remarkable interview with the BBC programme Panorama in November 1995. Millions watched. During the interview, Diana spoke openly about her marriage, emotional struggles, bulimia, media pressure, and Charles's relationship with Camilla. One line became legendary when Diana referred to there being 3 of us in this marriage, making the relationship feel a bit crowded. The interview was explosive. Royal families traditionally guarded privacy carefully. Diana had broken through that silence and directly described her suffering to the public. She also spoke about her desire to be a queen of people's hearts rather than focusing only on constitutional status. That idea captured something people had already sensed about her. Diana's power did not primarily come from royal tradition. It came from emotional connection. People felt that she understood suffering because she herself had suffered. They saw a woman who was beautiful yet insecure, privileged yet lonely, famous yet emotionally vulnerable, royal yet deeply human. In August 1996, Charles and Diana's divorce was finalized. Diana retained the title Diana, Princess of Wales, but she no longer used the style Her Royal Highness. Constitutionally, her position had changed. Emotionally, however, millions of people continued seeing her as their princess. The divorce marked the end of one identity and the beginning of another. For the first time since entering royal life, Diana had greater freedom to decide how she wanted to use her public role. She reduced the enormous number of charities with which she had previously been associated and concentrated on selected causes where she believed she could have the greatest impact. One of those causes would become internationally significant: landmines. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola with the British Red Cross. Angola had endured years of conflict, and landmines remained hidden across large areas. These weapons did not disappear when wars ended. They remained buried underground, waiting. A child could step on one. A farmer could accidentally activate one. A family returning to its village could lose a member in seconds. Landmines could kill, but they could also leave survivors without arms or legs, creating lifelong physical, emotional, and economic consequences. Diana visited people who had been injured by landmines. She listened to them. She met children who had lost limbs. Then came one of the most iconic images of her life. Wearing protective equipment, Diana walked through a cleared path in a minefield. The photographs traveled around the world. Critics accused her of involving herself in a political issue. Diana continued. She understood exactly how her celebrity worked. A humanitarian organization might publish a report containing devastating statistics, but millions of people might never read it. Put Princess Diana in a minefield, however, and the world looked. She used fame to force attention towards suffering. Later in 1997, she continued drawing attention to landmine victims and clearance efforts. The international campaign to prohibit anti-personnel mines already involved many activists and organizations, and Diana became one of its most recognizable supporters. Months after her death, the Mine Ban Treaty was opened for signature in Ottawa in December 1997. Although Diana alone did not create the movement, her involvement gave it extraordinary global visibility. By this time, Diana had become something unique. She was no longer performing the traditional role of a senior working royal, yet her international influence remained enormous. Presidents wanted to meet her. Charities wanted her support. Designers wanted to dress her. Photographers wanted to capture her every movement. Newspapers knew that placing Diana on the front page could dramatically increase attention. This freedom brought opportunities, but it also intensified the greatest danger surrounding her life: media obsession. Diana's relationship with photographers was extremely complicated. She understood the media better than most public figures. At times, she used photographs strategically to promote charitable causes or shape public perception. But she also experienced relentless invasion of privacy. Paparazzi photographers followed her constantly. They waited outside restaurants. They followed cars. They photographed holidays. They pursued romantic partners. They tried to capture images of her children. They photographed her from extraordinary distances using powerful lenses. An ordinary dinner could become international news. A private holiday could generate hundreds of photographs. A moment with another person could produce weeks of speculation. The demand for Diana photographs was enormous because the public's fascination with her seemed endless. During the summer of 1997, attention became particularly intense. Diana spent time with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian-born businessman Mohammed Al Fayed, whose family owned the Hotel Ritz Paris and had other major business interests. Diana and Dodi were photographed together during holidays in the Mediterranean. The photographs created a media storm. Was Diana in love? Would she marry Dodi? Was this simply a summer relationship? What would the royal family think? Newspapers competed aggressively for new pictures. Photographers followed the couple across Europe. Diana, finally free from her failed marriage and trying to build a private life, found herself surrounded more intensely than ever. Then came the final night. On August 30, 1997, Diana and Dodi were in Paris. They had spent time at the Ritz Hotel. Photographers were gathered around, hoping to capture images of them. Late that night, Diana and Dodi left the hotel in a Mercedes driven by Henri Paul, the hotel's acting head of security. Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard, was also in the car. Shortly after midnight, during the early hours of August 31st, the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The car crashed violently into a pillar. Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul died at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones survived despite suffering severe injuries. Diana was still alive when emergency workers reached her. She was transported to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. Doctors tried desperately to save her. They could not. Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead in the early morning of August 31, 1997. She was 36 years old. Across the world, people woke to news that seemed impossible. Princess Diana was dead. At first, many thought there must have been some mistake. Television schedules were interrupted. Radio stations changed programming. Newsrooms around the world raced to confirm details. People stared at screens in disbelief. A woman who had seemed almost constantly visible was suddenly gone. The scale of public grief that followed stunned Britain and much of the world. People traveled to Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace carrying flowers. Then more flowers arrived. Then thousands more. The sea of bouquets grew larger and larger until enormous sections of ground were covered. People left handwritten letters. Children left drawings. Some left candles. Others left photographs. Many simply stood silently and cried. They had never met Diana. Yet they grieved as though they had lost someone they knew. Part of that reaction came from the unique relationship Diana had built with the public. For years, people had watched her life unfold in real time. They had seen the shy bride, the glamorous princess, the young mother, the troubled wife, the humanitarian, the divorced woman beginning a new life. Her pain had become public. Her happiness had become public. Her mistakes had become public. Her growth had become public. People felt they had accompanied her through the stages of her life. Now they were accompanying her through death. The response of the royal family became another major public issue. Queen Elizabeth II and other members of the family were at Balmoral in Scotland, where William and Harry were staying. From the royal family's perspective, protecting two boys who had suddenly lost their mother was an immediate priority. But the public wanted visible royal mourning. As flowers accumulated and grief intensified, newspapers began criticizing the palace for appearing too distant. Why was the flag over Buckingham Palace not lowered? Why had the Queen not spoken publicly? Why did the royal family seem absent while the nation was crying? The pressure grew. Eventually, Queen Elizabeth returned to London and delivered a televised address on September 5. Speaking as both monarch and grandmother, she paid tribute to Diana and acknowledged the extraordinary public grief. The following day, September 6, 1997, Diana's funeral took place. Millions lined streets or watched television broadcasts around the world. Her coffin traveled through London as crowds stood in silence. Perhaps the most painful image of the day was the sight of Prince William and Prince Harry walking behind their mother's coffin. William was 15. Harry was 12. They walked beside their father, Prince Charles, their grandfather Prince Philip, and Diana's brother Charles Spencer. For the world, it was history. For William and Harry, it was their mother. That distinction gave the moment its heartbreaking power. During the service at Westminster Abbey, Diana's brother delivered a highly memorable tribute. Elton John performed a rewritten version of "Candle in the Wind," transformed into a farewell to Diana. After the funeral, Diana was buried at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate where she had spent part of her childhood. Her grave was placed on an island within a lake, away from the crowds and photographers that had followed so much of her adult life. The woman who had spent years surrounded by noise was finally laid to rest in quiet. But her story did not end there. In many ways, Diana became even more culturally powerful after her death. She became a symbol through which people discussed the monarchy, celebrity culture, privacy, journalism, mental health, motherhood, humanitarianism, marriage, divorce, and the expectations placed upon famous women. Her image appeared in documentaries, books, films, television dramas, exhibitions, magazines, photographs, and artworks. Every generation seemed to rediscover her. Some discovered Diana as the beautiful young woman marrying Prince Charles in 1981. Others encountered the humanitarian walking through a minefield. Others saw the panorama interview. Others learned about her through William and Harry. Still others discovered her decades later through films, television series, social media clips, and documentaries. Her story continued changing depending on who was telling it. To some, she was a victim of an emotionally difficult royal system. To others, she was a complicated public figure who understood how to use media attention to her advantage. To many, she was a humanitarian whose compassion transformed the image of modern royalty. To fashion historians, she was an icon whose style evolved dramatically from shy aristocratic teenager to confident international celebrity. To mental health advocates, her willingness to discuss bulimia and emotional distress helped break social taboos. To AIDS campaigners, her physical contact with patients helped challenge ignorance and stigma. To landmine campaigners, her visits gave unprecedented attention to a humanitarian crisis. To millions of ordinary people, she was simply Diana. One of her most lasting influences can be seen in the way public figures now speak about vulnerability. Royal families historically survived partly through distance. Mystery created authority. Emotions were controlled. Personal problems were kept private. Diana represented something very different. She cried. She admitted insecurity. She spoke about eating disorders. She discussed marital problems. She described emotional suffering. She talked openly about needing love. She allowed people to see imperfection. That vulnerability violated many traditional expectations of royal behavior, but it also made people identify with her. A princess was supposed to represent perfection. Diana represented humanity. That distinction changed the relationship between royalty and the public. Her approach to charity also influenced expectations. People increasingly expected prominent humanitarian figures not merely to provide their names to organizations but to engage personally with the individuals affected. Diana demonstrated the emotional power of presence. When she visited someone suffering from illness, she did not behave as though that person was a frightening medical case. She approached them as a person. When she met children, she often lowered herself physically so that she could look directly into their eyes. When she encountered someone who had lost limbs to a landmine, she focused attention not on their disability but on their dignity. These gestures appear small. But sometimes history changes through small gestures repeated in front of millions of people. Her sons became the most personal part of her legacy. William and Harry grew into adulthood under extraordinary scrutiny. Both have spoken in different ways about the effect of losing their mother at such young ages. Diana's influence can be seen in their public discussion of mental health, emotional well-being, veterans, homelessness, children, and humanitarian causes. William has supported homelessness initiatives and mental health campaigns, areas connected in spirit to causes his mother cared about. Harry has repeatedly spoken about grief and mental health and has supported veterans through projects including the Invictus Games. Their paths eventually became very different, but Diana remained a powerful presence in both of their public stories. Her influence also extended through her grandchildren, who grew up hearing about the grandmother they never met. As the years passed, public discussion of Diana became more complicated. Investigations examined the circumstances surrounding the Paris crash. Conspiracy theories appeared. Questions were raised about paparazzi involvement. Official investigations eventually concluded that the crash resulted from a combination of factors, including Henri Paul's impaired driving and excessive speed, while paparazzi pursuit also formed part of the circumstances surrounding the journey. Later, another controversy emerged surrounding Diana's 1995 Panorama interview when investigations established that journalist Martin Bashir had used deceptive methods to secure access to Diana. The revelations created renewed discussion about Diana's vulnerability and the behavior of the media around her. Yet none of these controversies erased the emotional connection people continued to feel. Diana remains fascinating because her story contains extraordinary contrasts. She was privileged but deeply unhappy. She lived in palaces but spoke about feeling trapped. She was photographed constantly but often felt unseen. She was admired by millions yet struggled with feelings of rejection. She became a symbol of beauty while privately struggling with bulimia. She married into one of the most powerful families in the world yet often felt powerless within her own marriage. She lost the fairy tale but discovered a purpose. And perhaps most importantly, she transformed personal pain into public empathy. Diana seemed to understand wounded people because she knew what it was like to be emotionally wounded herself. When she visited someone alone in a hospital, perhaps she understood loneliness. When she met someone rejected by society, perhaps she understood what rejection felt like. When she spoke to people experiencing depression, perhaps she knew the darkness they were describing. Her compassion did not appear rehearsed. That was why people trusted it. There was also extraordinary courage in her evolution. The Diana who entered the royal family was young and hesitant. The Diana who emerged from the breakdown of her marriage was dramatically different. Her clothing changed. Her posture changed. Her public speaking became more confident. Her charitable focus became sharper. She seemed determined to discover who Diana was without Charles, without the fairy tale, and without the expectations attached to becoming queen. That transformation is one reason her story continues inspiring women. Many people experience moments when the future they imagined collapses. A relationship ends. A marriage fails. A career disappears. A family changes. A dream no longer seems possible. Diana's life demonstrated that losing one identity does not necessarily mean losing your entire future. After her marriage collapsed, she did not disappear. She reinvented herself. She became internationally influential on her own terms. She showed that softness and strength were not opposites. A person could cry and still be courageous. A person could experience depression and still help others. A person could be wounded and still become a source of healing. A person could lose a crown and gain a voice. This is perhaps why people continue calling her the People's Princess. The phrase captured something no official title could provide. A royal title comes from an institution. Public affection must be earned. Diana earned that affection through thousands of interactions, photographs, hospital visits, charitable projects, interviews, moments of vulnerability, and simple acts of kindness. People remembered the way she touched someone whom others were afraid to touch. They remembered her holding children. They remembered her standing beside people suffering from AIDS. They remembered her walking through an Angolan minefield. They remembered her hugging her sons. They remembered her laughing. They remembered her crying. They remembered the sadness behind her eyes during difficult years. They remembered the confidence that appeared later. They remembered a woman trying desperately to build a meaningful life while the entire world watched. Her fashion remains influential too. During her engagement and early marriage, Diana's clothing reflected a romantic, traditional image. Large dresses, pastel colors, formal hats, and dramatic gowns helped create the fairy tale princess the public expected. Over time, her style changed. Her outfits became sharper, cleaner, and more confident. She learned which silhouettes suited her. She understood how clothing communicated personality. By the 1990s, Diana had become a sophisticated fashion icon whose dresses, suits, casual clothing, athletic wear, and evening gowns continue influencing fashion decades later. Perhaps the most famous example came in 1994 when she attended an event wearing a striking black dress on the same night that a television interview involving Prince Charles attracted enormous attention. The outfit later became popularly known as the revenge dress. Whether Diana herself thought of it in exactly those terms is less important than what the public saw. They saw transformation. The shy young bride was gone. In her place stood a confident woman comfortable with being seen on her own terms. That transformation captured the imagination of millions. Yet reducing Diana to fashion would miss the heart of her story. Clothes made her visible. Compassion made her unforgettable. There were many beautiful women in the 1980s and 1990s. There were many celebrities. There were many members of royal families. Diana's impact came from combining extraordinary visibility with extraordinary emotional accessibility. She could enter a room filled with powerful people and command every camera, then sit beside a sick child and make that child appear to be the most important person in the room. That ability cannot easily be manufactured. She understood human attention. She understood what it meant to be listened to. Perhaps because she had spent so much of her own life feeling that people were talking about her rather than listening to her, she became unusually determined to listen to others. For someone surrounded by noise, listening became one of her greatest gifts. Years after her death, People who met Diana often described remembering the feeling of the encounter rather than merely the words exchanged. They remembered her eyes. They remembered her focus. They remembered feeling that she genuinely cared. That may be the most powerful explanation for her legacy. People rarely remember every sentence someone says. They remember how that person made them feel. Diana made countless people feel visible. Her death therefore felt personal to millions. When she died at only 36, people did not simply mourn the life she had already lived. They mourned the future she never had. What would Diana have become at 40? At 50? At 60? Would she have expanded her humanitarian work? Would she have played an important role in global campaigns? Would she have found lasting love? Would she have enjoyed watching William and Harry become adults? Would she have been present at their weddings? What kind of grandmother would she have been? What advice would she have given them? What would she have thought of the enormous changes that later took place within the royal family? Those questions can never be answered. That unfinished quality gives her story an additional sadness. Diana died at a moment when she appeared to be entering a new stage of life. The marriage was over. The divorce was finalized. Her children were growing older. Her humanitarian identity was becoming more focused. She had greater independence than at any point since entering the royal world. She was still searching for stability, but she appeared determined to create a future of her own. Then, suddenly, there was no future. Only memory. But memory can be powerful. Diana's memory lives in photographs of her surrounded by children. It lives in images of her shaking the hand of an AIDS patient. It lives in photographs of her wearing protective equipment in Angola. It lives in videos of her laughing with William and Harry. It lives in countless stories told by nurses, doctors, charity workers, patients, children, homeless people, and ordinary members of the public who encountered her. It lives in the charities she supported. It lives in the causes she made visible. It lives in conversations about mental health. It lives in debates about media ethics. It lives in the continuing fascination with royal life. It lives in the public lives of her sons. And it lives in the idea that kindness can sometimes create a form of influence greater than status. Diana possessed status from the moment she married Charles. But status alone never explains why the world remembers her. The deeper reason is that she attempted to transform status into service. She used cameras that followed her to make people look at forgotten patients. She used newspaper headlines to make people discuss landmines. She used interviews to make people talk about bulimia and emotional suffering. She used physical touch to challenge fear surrounding HIV. She used motherhood to demonstrate that royal children could experience warmth, normality, and direct affection. She used vulnerability to make royalty feel human. Her story also serves as a warning. Fame can provide enormous power, but it can also destroy privacy. Public fascination can become obsession. A photograph can become more valuable than the dignity of the person being photographed. Celebrity culture can make people believe they have a right to every private moment of another person's life. Diana benefited from publicity and was harmed by it. The relationship was always complicated. She knew how to create powerful images, yet she also desperately wanted moments when the cameras would disappear. She needed the media to communicate her humanitarian causes, yet the same media followed her romantic life relentlessly. She became one of the first modern global celebrities to experience this contradiction at an almost unimaginable level. Today, in an age of smartphones, social media, constant online commentary, viral videos, and 24-hour digital attention, her experience feels even more relevant. The technology has changed. The question remains the same. Where does public interest end and a human being's right to privacy begin? Diana never found a peaceful answer. Perhaps that is why photographs of her alone can feel so haunting. Behind every image was another camera. Behind every camera was a market. Behind that market were millions of people wanting more. More photographs. More stories. More secrets. More romance. More scandal. More Diana. The demand seemed endless. Her life was consumed by visibility. And yet, ironically, one of Diana's greatest contributions was teaching people to look at those who were normally invisible. The homeless person sleeping on a street. The AIDS patient others were afraid to touch. The child injured by war. The person struggling emotionally behind a smile. The mother facing illness. The patient others avoided. The survivor whose body had been changed forever by a landmine. Diana turned cameras toward them. That may be the most beautiful reversal in her story. The woman everyone wanted to look at repeatedly asked the world to look at someone else. Look at this child. Look at this patient. Look at this suffering. Look at this injustice. Look at this person. Do not turn away. That message remains powerful. Diana was never perfect. She had flaws. She made mistakes. She sometimes reacted emotionally. She had complicated relationships. She lived within a world where personal, institutional, and media conflicts became almost impossible to separate. Myth eventually surrounded her, as myths often surround people who die young. But perfection was never the real reason people loved her. They loved her because she seemed imperfect. She was not the unreachable princess of childhood stories. She was a woman who struggled. She wanted love and sometimes failed to find it. She wanted acceptance and sometimes felt rejected. She wanted privacy and lived under constant surveillance. She wanted happiness and experienced long periods of sadness. She wanted a successful marriage and endured a painful divorce. She wanted to protect her children but knew she could never completely protect them from royal responsibility or media attention. And despite all of that, she kept reaching outward. That is why the story remains emotional. Diana could have allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, during some of the most difficult years of her life, she increasingly directed her energy toward people experiencing even greater suffering. There is something deeply human about that. Sometimes the people who understand pain most clearly become the people most capable of recognizing it in others. Diana seemed to belong to that category. She turned wounds into empathy. She turned loneliness into connection. She turned celebrity into attention for humanitarian causes. She turned rejection into independence. She turned vulnerability into a kind of courage. She turned an unhappy fairy tale into a story of personal transformation. Perhaps this is the real meaning of Diana's legacy. It is not simply that she was beautiful. It is not simply that she married a prince. It is not simply that billions of people knew her face. It is not even simply that her death shocked the world. Her legacy lies in the idea that humanity matters more than position. A crown cannot replace compassion. A palace cannot guarantee happiness. Wealth cannot eliminate loneliness. Status cannot heal emotional wounds. Public admiration cannot substitute for private love. And sometimes the most powerful thing a famous person can do is kneel beside someone whom society has forgotten and make that person feel important. Diana understood that. Her life began within privilege, carried her into royalty, pushed her through extraordinary suffering, and eventually allowed her to discover a voice that belonged uniquely to her. She began as Lady Diana Spencer. The world watched her become Princess Diana. The breakdown of her marriage forced her to become something else. Diana. Simply Diana. A mother. A humanitarian. A public figure. A woman searching for freedom. A woman trying to understand herself. A woman carrying extraordinary emotional wounds. A woman capable of extraordinary compassion. Her death froze her forever at 36, but her influence continued moving. Children who were not alive when she died know her name. People watch old footage of Diana and feel an emotional connection to a woman from another era. Her dresses are displayed in exhibitions. Her photographs continue circulating. Her charitable work is studied. Her interviews are debated. Her marriage is examined repeatedly. Her relationship with the press remains a warning. Her sons continue shaping their own complicated relationships with monarchy, family, public duty, privacy, and media attention. And every new generation asks the same question. Why did people love Diana so much? Perhaps the answer is simpler than the thousands of books, films, articles, and documentaries written about her. People believed she cared. Not because a palace statement told them she cared. Not because a royal title required her to care. They believed it because they watched her behavior. They saw the touch. They saw the hug. They saw the tears. They saw the attention she gave to vulnerable people. They saw the difference between ceremony and compassion. Diana understood that sometimes love is communicated through the smallest actions. Sitting beside someone. Holding a hand. Listening without judgment. Looking directly into someone's eyes. Touching someone others are afraid to touch. Giving someone a moment of dignity. Those actions became part of her identity. Long after the castles, gowns, scandals, marriages, interviews, and newspaper headlines fade into history, those images may remain. A princess holding the hand of a patient. A mother embracing her children. A woman walking through a minefield because she wanted the world to pay attention. A human being using the extraordinary spotlight placed upon her to illuminate people standing in darkness. That is why Diana became more than a royal figure. She became an emotional symbol. For some, she symbolized compassion. For some, freedom. For some, vulnerability. For some, resistance against rigid expectations. For some, the pain of a failed marriage. For some, the courage to begin again. For some, the danger of media obsession. For some, motherhood. For some, humanitarian activism. For many, she represented several of these things at the same time. Her life contained triumph and tragedy in almost equal measure. She reached extraordinary heights of fame but struggled to find emotional security. She was loved by strangers across the world but often felt unloved within the relationship that was supposed to define her future. She belonged to one of history's most famous families yet spent years trying to establish an identity outside it. She wore crowns and diamonds yet became most powerful when she ignored distance and simply touched another person. Diana's story therefore does not end inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. It continues whenever someone chooses compassion instead of fear. It continues whenever a famous person uses attention to highlight a neglected cause. It continues whenever people speak honestly about mental health instead of hiding their suffering. It continues whenever society questions whether photographers, journalists, or online audiences have gone too far in pursuing a human being. It continues whenever William or Harry speaks about their mother. It continues whenever someone sees a photograph of Diana embracing a child and understands immediately why that picture mattered. It continues because Diana represented something people desperately wanted from public figures: humanity. Not perfection. Humanity. The ability to care. The courage to admit pain. The willingness to connect. The strength to rebuild. The determination to use influence for people who possess very little influence of their own. She entered public life as a young woman expected to play the role of a perfect princess. Life destroyed that fantasy. But from the broken pieces of the fantasy emerged a far more powerful person. The world did not ultimately love Diana because her fairy tale succeeded. The world loved her because it failed, and she kept going. She experienced heartbreak and kept loving. She experienced humiliation and kept standing. She experienced loneliness and kept reaching toward others. She experienced fear and walked into difficult places. She experienced enormous public judgment and still tried to speak honestly. She lost the future she had once imagined and began building another one. That new future was cut terribly short. But 36 years were enough for Diana to leave an influence that continued long after the final cameras stopped flashing. Her name still brings immediate recognition. Her face remains one of the most recognizable faces of the 20th century. Her story still produces sadness because people know how abruptly it ended. But perhaps remembering Diana only through the tragedy of her death would be unfair. Her life deserves to be remembered for what happened before that final night. Remember the teenager who worked with children. Remember the frightened young woman entering royal life. Remember the mother determined to give her sons affection. Remember the patient visits. Remember the AIDS wards. Remember the homeless shelters. Remember the landmine survivors. Remember the handshakes. Remember the hugs. Remember the laughter. Remember the moments when she stepped beyond royal protocol because another human being mattered more. Remember the woman who gradually understood that her greatest power was not being married to the future king. Her greatest power was making people care. That power remains. Years pass. Governments change. Royal generations change. New celebrities become famous. New scandals dominate headlines. New technologies transform society. But Diana's image still appears. A familiar smile. A slightly lowered head. Eyes that could appear playful in one photograph and deeply sad in another. That face carries an entire era with it. For those who lived through her lifetime, it may bring memories of exactly where they were when they heard the news of her death. For younger people, it represents a historical figure who somehow still feels modern. Perhaps that is because the issues surrounding her never disappeared. Mental health. Eating disorders. Media harassment. Unhappy relationships. Divorce. Motherhood. Female independence. Celebrity obsession. Public judgment. Humanitarian responsibility. The search for authentic identity. These are not old issues. They are still with us. Diana's life therefore speaks beyond its historical moment. Her story asks difficult questions. What happens when a shy young person suddenly becomes one of the most famous people alive? What happens when an institution values tradition while an individual needs emotional understanding? What happens when a marriage becomes part of national mythology before the two people inside it truly understand each other? What happens when the public believes that loving a celebrity gives them ownership over that celebrity's private life? What happens when pain is hidden because someone feels required to smile? What happens when a person finally decides to speak? Diana spent much of her adult life living inside these questions. She never found perfect answers. Perhaps nobody could. But she forced people to begin asking them. And that itself was important. Diana showed that titles cannot erase emotional reality. A princess can have depression. A princess can have an eating disorder. A princess can experience rejection. A princess can feel lonely. A princess can need help. Those truths challenged the artificial distance surrounding royalty. They also told ordinary people something important. Pain does not discriminate. Someone can appear to possess everything and still be suffering. Never assume that a smile tells the whole story. That lesson might be one of Diana's most enduring gifts. Behind every polished photograph is a human being. Behind every public role is a private emotional life. Behind every beautiful appearance may be a struggle nobody else can see. Perhaps that understanding made Diana kinder. She knew appearances could deceive. So when she met people, she tried to look beyond appearances. She looked for the person. Ultimately, Princess Diana's life cannot be explained by a single label. She was neither simply a saint nor merely a tragic victim. She was a complex woman living under extraordinary circumstances. She could be vulnerable and strategic, romantic and independent, traditional and rebellious, elegant and informal, privileged and emotionally wounded, famous and lonely, strong and fragile. These contradictions made her real. And reality proved far more compelling than the fairy tale. The fairy tale said a beautiful young woman married a prince and lived happily ever after. Reality said she married a prince, suffered, became a mother, lost herself, found herself, endured public humiliation, discovered new purpose, embraced humanitarian work, fought for independence, and died just as a new chapter of life appeared to be opening. Reality was sadder. But it was also more meaningful. Because in reality, Diana became something she may never have become inside a perfect fairy tale. She became a voice. She became an example. She became a symbol. She became the woman remembered not merely for the crown she once stood near, but for the hearts she reached. That is why people still speak her name with affection. That is why flowers still appear at memorials associated with her. That is why photographs of Diana with patients remain emotionally powerful. That is why documentaries about her continue attracting audiences. That is why her sons are repeatedly asked about her. That is why people who never lived during her lifetime still know exactly who Princess Diana was. She entered history as the wife of a future king. She remained in history as something entirely her own. Diana. The woman who taught millions that compassion can cross every social boundary. The woman who demonstrated that vulnerability does not cancel strength. The woman who showed that a person can be wounded without becoming cruel. The woman who proved that sometimes the softest gesture can challenge the hardest prejudice. The woman who could walk into a hospital room filled with fear and make it warmer simply by sitting beside someone. The woman who could turn a minefield into an international headline not because she wanted attention for herself, but because she wanted attention for the victims. The woman who wanted her sons to understand that royal blood did not make them more human than anybody else. The woman whose marriage failed publicly but whose influence grew beyond the institution into which she had married. The woman who died young yet became timeless. In the end, perhaps the most important part of Diana's story is not how she died. It is how she chose to live once she realized that the life planned for her was not going to make her happy. She chose to search for purpose. She chose to connect. She chose to speak. She chose to care. She chose, again and again, to reach across the distance created by status and touch another human being. And millions reached back. That connection survived the divorce. It survived the loss of royal status. It survived scandal. It survived criticism. It even survived death. More than any crown, palace, ceremony, or title, that connection became Diana's true legacy. A princess by marriage. A humanitarian by choice. A mother by love. A global icon by circumstance. And in the memory of millions, forever the people's princess.